Tansen itute magtiar Wheatley Nisagasun o Pasquakuche. Tawao, welcome to APTN National News. The federal government, the National Children's Chiefs Commission, and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society have submitted their plans this week to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal for long-term child welfare reform. The head of the Caring Society says their plan is much more thorough than the government's. APTN's Fraser Needham has more.
It's called the Loving Justice Plan, and it's more than 100 pages long. Caring Society Executive Director Cindy Blackstock says their plan is the result of months of deep consultations with First Nations communities.
We did a national consultation outside of Ontario. We got over 105 submissions from First Nations governments, from First Nations organizations, experts, elders, and young people. Their voices are threaded throughout that whole document. And ours actually is based on how do we stop Canada's discrimination and prevent it from happening again.
In contrast, Blackstock says Ottawa's plan is only 22 pages long and largely based on affidavits from a handful of federal civil servants. Nevertheless, the two plans are similar in the funding they call for to address long-term reform in First Nations child and family services. Canada's plan proposes $27 billion from 2027 to 2034 for regions outside of Ontario. The Caring Society and Children's Chiefs Commission's plan calls for $17.5 billion over 5 years. At a press conference in Ottawa on Monday, Indigenous Services Minister Mandy Galmasti said the government is open to working with both the Caring Society and Children's Chiefs Commission. But Blackstock says this has not really been the case so far. From what herself and Vuntut-Gwitchin First Nation Chief Pauline Frost, who is chair of the Children's Chiefs Commission, have experienced.
However, their legal submissions have actually said there's no utility in talking to the Caring Society or AFN, and they only wanted to meet with Chief Frost 2 times and felt that was sufficient.
In the coming days, Blackstock says her organization will be doing a more detailed analysis of the government's plan.
In fairness, in 22 pages, there's a lot of questions that we have that aren't answered in that document. That's one of the key pieces, is what are the decisions Canada's holding for itself? What is the discretion that they're giving on those decisions? And how is it holding itself accountable to stop hurting our kids? Those are the big 3 that we need to nail down.
Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
A First Nation in British Columbia has entered into the acquisition phase of their 5th casino. APTN's Tina House has the details.
The Nanaimo First Nation is in negotiations to once again purchase a casino, but this time it's in Coquitlam, BC, the Great Canadian Casino, formerly known as the Hard Rock Casino.
Our economic development arm, Petroglyph Development Group, or PDG, has entered into a definitive agreement with our partners at Great Canadian Entertainment for PDG to purchase Casino Vancouver.
This will be the 5th casino the First Nation has bought in the last year.
Our casino business now includes Casino Nanaimo, Elements Casino Victoria, and our purchase agreements for River Rock Casino Resort and Chances Maple Ridge. We are honored to expand our economic portfolio in Coquitlam, and we do so with deep gratitude to the generations of Nanaimo whose big work, leadership, and vision made this moment possible. These opportunities are not taken lightly. They are the result of thoughtful, measured decision-making guided by our elders and ancestors and by our responsibility to build a strong and resilient Nanaimo economy.
For the purchase of the River Rock Casino, the Nanaimo First Nation partnered with the Musqueam Indian Band. In a statement, Matthew Affinson, the CEO of Great Canadian Entertainment, said, "We are pleased to pass this legacy into the hands of the Nanaimo First Nation and the vision they hold for the business's future. We have every confidence that PDG and Nanaimo will continue to elevate this and their other properties for years to come." The sale of the casino is still subject to regulatory approvals. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Buffalo. One man's tireless efforts to help disadvantaged youth, another man's quest to preserve culture through traditional sports, and a music festival aimed to help First Nations students adapt to life away from home. Those are just some of the stories to come out of Northern Ontario over the past year. APTN's Mike McDonald takes a look back on 2025.
This is Aubrey. This is Isla, who does not want to show her face.
In 2025, we checked in with Peter Panetta and his underground gym and youth center, which serves disadvantaged children and youth in Thunder Bay, the vast majority of them being Indigenous. Panetta, who relies solely on donations to keep the center going, has been running the gym for nearly 30 years with no plans to stop. The sport of boxing is what gave birth to the underground gym, and it remains a cornerstone of the center. Panetta says the sport builds discipline and resilience.
Yeah, well, you know what? I'm brutal, but life is even more harder than me. So if they can take it from me, they can take it out anywhere. It doesn't matter. You see them struggling, and you see them huffing and puffing and struggling, but they persevere. They keep going. So what does that tell you? They're going to do the same no matter where they go.
Panetta says he would like to see Northern First Nation communities adopting the same model that has made the underground successful. This past year, we introduced you to Frank Bello of Garden River First Nation, who is working to keep the tradition of lacrosse alive in his community by making sticks in the traditional way. Bello told us the game we know as lacrosse was played on Turtle Island long before European contact, and around the same time, similar games were played overseas, which he says points to a spiritual connection.
Part of that dream we all got. Everybody got a vision to make to play a game, but we all interpret it in our own way.
We follow the process of making a stick, which takes at least a few days beginning to end, not including the time it takes to find the wood. Back in Thunder Bay, organizers of the Wake the Giant Music Festival celebrated another successful event, which serves as a fundraiser and awareness campaign for Dennis Franklin Cromarty High School. The school hosts a number of Indigenous students from First Nations communities in the far north, many of whom are away from home for the first time. Musical acts such as Crystal Shawanda of Wikwemikong First Nation, the tragically hip cover band The Poets from Moose Factory, Ontario, Neon Dreams, Prozac, and the Black Eyed Peas performed at this year's festival. Mike McDonald, APTN National News, Thunder Bay.
And we head to Montreal for the 10th anniversary of a magazine that focuses on academic success of First Nations people. That and more right after the break. Cheskwa. Come on in, Pete Tigwe. Earlier this month, the University of Quebec in Montreal launched the 6th edition of the magazine on perseverance and academic success among First Nations peoples. It was also the 10th anniversary of this unique scientific publication. Stephanie Desev tells us more.
L'éducation est la pierre angulaire de notre passé, du présent, mais aussi de notre futur.
Regional Chief of the AFNQL and the Minister of Quebec Families both attended the launch.
Plus que jamais, il y a des jeunes et moins jeunes, en fait, qui vont obtenir leur diplôme.
The Quebec Minister of Families, Catherine Champagne-Jourdain, recalled her personal struggles at school.
J'avais de la misère à figurer pourquoi j'apprenais tout ce que j'apprends au secondaire, à quoi ça me servirait. Vous savez, pour moi, ça m'aura pris en tout et partout entre 7 et 8 ans pour terminer mon secondaire. Ça a été difficile pour moi parce que fort probablement, c'était complexe de me projeter dans le futur, de voir ce que là où j'aurais une pertinence, où j'aurais un apport significatif. C'était important pour moi.
Minister Champagne-Jourdain is Innu from Makimani-Utanam. Her parents gave her an important tool, perseverance.
Finalement, j'ai persévéré. J'ai persévéré parce que j'avais des parents qui croyaient en l'éducation, des parents qui étaient bien outillés pour m'accompagner là-dedans. Mais ce n'est pas le cas de tout le monde. On ne vient pas tous au monde avec la même boîte à outils.
She also believes perseverance must be passed on.
Actuellement, eh bien, je vis ça avec mes enfants, l'arbre. Mais je peux constater que comparativement à mon époque, ils sont beaucoup mieux outillés.
In 2022, Catherine Champagne-Jourdain made Quebec history. She became the first Indigenous woman appointed to the Quebec National Assembly, 61 years after the election of the first non-Indigenous woman. Marco Bacon is the founder of the magazine and of the symposium. He points out that the articles can also become tools.
Ben déjà, vous avez déjà des initiatives, des choses que vous pourriez tout de suite appliquer en adaptant un petit peu selon la nation. De l'appliquer tout de suite dans votre classe, dans votre environnement. Mais vous avez un nom de la personne, de communiquer avec, puis peut-être partir une collaboration.
Since its first edition, the scientific magazine has published 115 articles. The magazine will be available after the holidays in schools, colleges, and friendship centers. Stéphanie Dosève, APTN National News, Montréal.
This year, Saskatchewan had many stories make headlines, from politics to justice. Video journalist Rachel May takes us through a year in review.
This year, a Prince Albert family marked 8 years without answers about their daughter's disappearance. Happy Charles was last seen April 3rd, 2017 in Prince Albert, and there has been no new information about her whereabouts. Her family was joined by other MMIWG families, including Ashley Morans, who has been missing since July 10th, 2018. Charles's father, Carson Poitras, says as time passes without answers, he wants Prince Albert police to renew their efforts to find Happy.
And it's almost like we don't matter anymore. Happy doesn't matter more. Happy, they don't seem to think is a person, a human, a mother, a grandmother. They think of her as a number.
The federal election made national headlines, with all party leaders making stops in Saskatoon. When Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre held a press conference, APTN asked how his proposed three-strike approach to violent offenses would address overcrowding in corrections facilities.
The good news is we have very few criminals in Canada. The bad news is they do a tremendous amount of damage. The same 40 offenders had to be arrested 6,000 times in Vancouver in a year. So that means 150 arrests per offender per year. Why didn't we just leave them in jail? There would be 6,000 fewer crimes if they were just left in prison after they started doing the damage. That's what we're going to leave them in jail. We're going to end the crime. It's going to be the biggest crackdown on crime in Canadian history.
On election night, most of Saskatchewan remained Conservative blue, but one large area turned red. Buckley Belanger won the Desnethi-Missinippi Churchill River riding for the Liberals.
And it's a huge piece of land. There's so much wealth on that piece of land. And what we're trying to do is make sure we connect the issues and challenges of our community to the wealth of that land so we can forge a better path forward for our children and grandchildren.
Belanger was appointed Secretary of State for Rural Development. In Indigenous politics, Métis Nation Saskatchewan held its own election. Glenn McCallum was re-elected MNS president, though some elected officials were not allowed to be sworn in. Sherry McLennan and Wendy Gervais were barred from the swearing-in and from the provincial Métis Council meetings until they apologized to MNS CEO Richard Quintel.
And I have no problem apologizing when I make a mistake. I don't think Sherry does either. However, we're very well aware that we have done nothing wrong.
After public backlash, Gervais and McLennan finally took their oaths in September, but they are still barred from provincial Métis Council meetings. Several members of the public were also issued cease and desist letters over social media activity and barred from MNS events. A forensic audit was carried out by the federal government on the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. The audit said more than $34 million in spending was unsupported, questionable, or ineligible. According to the federal government, more than $23 million of that was linked to COVID-19 funding. For their part, the FSIN said that they have never received a line-by-line audit and called the COVID-19 findings baseless, saying funds were used to protect elders, families, and children. Back in the justice system, a family seeking justice for over 5 years is nearing the end of their court process. Megan Gallagher was murdered in September 2020 in a garage in Saskatchewan. Her remains were found in September 2022 on the South Saskatchewan River near the town of St. Louis. 9 people were charged in her death. Cheyenne Petitus and Summer Sky Henry received 7-year sentences for manslaughter. Robert Bobby Thomas pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison with no parole for 18 years. Ernest Vernon Whitehead, Jessica Badger, and John Wayne Sanderson received sentences ranging from 18 months to 3 years for indignity to human remains. Charges against Thomas Sutherland for manslaughter and Robin John for unlawful confinement and aggravated assault were stayed. All of these proceedings were under a publication ban to protect fair trial rights. Roderick Sutherland, the only accused to go to jury trial, was convicted of manslaughter, unlawful confinement, and indignity to human remains in October. Sentencing submissions were heard December 19th. Roderick Sutherland will be sentenced on April 13th, 2026. Megan's father, Brian Gallagher, spoke outside the courthouse, expressing frustration with delays and the court system's handling of MMIWG cases.
And the reality is that if these things continue to happen and if they continue to get worse, it could be your child, your mother, your father, anybody. When people are able to manipulate the system to ways to get away with murder, it's just ridiculous.
Rachel May, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
And we take you to Ottawa for a year in review in just a few short minutes. Cheska. Tawau, welcome back. 2025 was quite the year on Parliament Hill in Ottawa. This year began with Justin Trudeau resigning as Prime Minister. He was replaced by former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney. The party under Carney has focused on the economy and fighting U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff threats. According to APTN's Fraser Needham, what role Indigenous issues and people will play in the new government remains to be seen.
It's become obvious to me with the internal battles that I cannot be the one to carry the Liberal standard into the next election.
After months of internal party turmoil and lagging polling numbers, Justin Trudeau stepped down as Prime Minister in the first week of January. Mark Carney easily won the Liberal leadership contest last March and then took the Liberals to a stunning election victory in April, taking 169 seats, just 3 shy of a majority government. Carney portrayed himself as the best leader to stand up to Donald Trump.
Who's ready? Who's ready? Who's ready to stand up for Canada with me? And who's ready? Who's ready to build Canada strong?
Ministre des Services aux Autochtones. A number of new Indigenous MPs were also elected, including Mandy Galmasti in northern Quebec and Rebecca Chartrand in northern Manitoba for the Liberals, and Billy Morin in Edmonton for the Conservatives. Galmasti became Minister of Indigenous Services and Chartrand to Northern Affairs. Leah Xan was re-elected in Winnipeg and Laurie Idlout in Nunavut for the NDP, but Blake Desjardins lost his seat for the party in Edmonton. The Carney government got off to a rocky start with First Nations by introducing Bill C-5, or the One Canadian Economy Act, in June. The bill fast-tracks approvals for economic projects deemed to be in the national interest. However, it was rammed through both houses of Parliament in just 2 weeks and without Indigenous consultation, angering First Nations leaders such as Mi'kmaq Senator Brian Francis.
Why are we rushing on such a consequential bill that deserves care and attention? We had the option to slow down. That was the message delivered clearly by National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepanek last week. She asked us to take the time to do things properly and reminded us that is how we build a better country. by listening, by working together, and by not rushing reconciliation.
Consequently, the government scheduled summit meetings with Indigenous leaders. The First Nations Summit took place with the Prime Minister in Gatineau, Quebec in July, and reviews were mixed.
The big push here, I think, is trying to create a framework for consultation, a framework for how are they going to see economic development or large-scale projects move throughout Canada, and they want to create a one-shop model that's going to work for everybody. I don't think that necessarily works. You have different cultures, different beliefs right across the country, and so some of us do things in a different way.
The Carney government introduced its first budget in early November with a focus on building the economy and engaging Indigenous people as economic partners. But groups like the Assembly of First Nations were generally unimpressed by the lack of funding to address Indigenous priorities.
Instead of closing the socioeconomic gaps between First Nations and non-Indigenous Canadians, this budget is going to make things worse. Ignoring those long-standing gaps and environmental standards will not help fast-track resource extraction projects.
Jocelyn Forsma, then CEO of the National Association of Friendship Centres, expressed disappointment at funding cuts to her organization.
I think I'm just really worried about what it signals for where this government's heading with reconciliation. I'm really concerned that reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is going to be contingent upon how we can demonstrate our benefit to the economy. And that's not really, what reconciliation was supposed to be about.
At the end of November, the Carney government signed a memorandum of understanding with Alberta that includes a proposed pipeline from that province to the west coast. The Liberals did so without consulting the BC government or coastal First Nations. This was met with negative response at the Assembly of First Nations winter meeting in early December in Ottawa. The Prime Minister did a question and answer session with chiefs at the end of the first day of the winter meeting and was taken to task by Nestaniga First Nation Chief Gary Cuises, whose community has been under a boil water advisory for more than 3 decades.
And hearing you comments that you've been lifting boil water advisories in Canada, but I don't know which part of country you're talking about. That's water is being lifted, but our community hasn't been lifted for 30 years.
To which Carney was forced to admit the government had failed the community.
And that's a failure, to be absolutely clear. You know it's a failure. You've lived through it most of your adult life. It's a failure of execution, and this is one of the things that this government is very focused on, is setting objectives, being clear about the objectives, determining why things have not worked as well as they should.
In the new year, the Prime Minister is committed to including First Nations in federal, provincial, and territorial First Ministers' meetings. The government has also said it'll introduce a First Nations Clean Water Act in the spring session. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
And that's all the time we have at this hour. I'm TR Wheatley. It's been quite the year. Winter solstice is behind us and the days are getting longer once again. Join me again one more time tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern for APTN's version of the 12 Days of Christmas, where we share greetings in Indigenous languages from coast to coast to coast and maybe hear a song or two. From all of us at APTN to all of you, Egase, Gitam, Kikawapamitinano.